Galway city. The sales of the Galway hooker here behind me are a bit of a giveaway. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the opening of one of the important buildings in this city of the tribes. The Catholic Cathedral this week is hosting thousands of people during the annual solemn novena, and for 5 decades it's been a centre of worship, but also one of the must-see buildings on the city's tourist trail. It was built over a number of years in the late 50s and the early 60s, and our reporter Pat McGrath has been looking at the history of this dominating feature in the city skyline.
A symbol of independent Ireland built to the glory of God. That was how President Sean T. O'Callaghan described plans for Galway's cathedral in the late 1950s. The first steps towards construction were taken decades earlier. A building fund was inaugurated in 1876 and over £100,000 was raised over the next 60 years. But it wasn't until 1937 that the project gained real momentum. On his appointment as bishop, Michael Brown declared he would bring the cathedral to fruition.
It was an extraordinary kind of design, I think, for the middle of the 20th century to be designing, working on a design that would have been popular about 400 or 500 years before seemed crazy. And it wasn't as if it was only just one kind of Renaissance style of architecture that he used, but it's a mixture. It's very eclectic.
He had a very definite vision of what he wanted. He wanted kind of 3 basic things. One was that it would be traditional. Of course, post-World War, and there was a huge influence from the Bauhaus architectural tradition in Germany, functionalism, concrete. Brown didn't want that. He wanted a traditional cathedral in sync with the great cathedrals of Europe. The second thing that he envisioned, the use of local material, so that it would have to be built out of limestone, that limestone would be the dominating material used, and also Connemara marble, which is used in the decoration. The third thing is that it would be specific to Galway, it would reflect Galway's architectural tradition. And as we know, Galway was the linking point with Spain during the Middle Ages, and so there was always a huge influence from Spanish architecture, art, music in medieval Galway, and that lasted right up until the 20th century. So Brown wanted his cathedral to reflect Spanish influence in Galway and Spanish architecture in Galway.
The cathedral stands on the site of the old Galway jail, which was acquired by the church in 1941. Construction began in 1958. The costs were met in large part by weekly donations of £0.50 made by every home in the dioceses of Galway, Kilmacduagh and Kilfenora for several years.
There were no enormous cranes. It was built more with barrows and hoists and lifts and muscle, really, but a huge amount of skill. And the foreman, Jack Lillis, he put together an extraordinary team. They were incidentally enormously proud of their work and of the finished product. It was a very big deal for them to be involved with it at all in the first place. You've got to remember that it was a construction the like of which had never been seen before in the west of Ireland. The sheer scale of it, enormity of it, and the complexity of it, and how long it actually took to build. And this is back in the 60s now. So it made a huge impact. And of course, like I say, the population passing by looked on in awe and in wonder at these stonemasons, or these men way up high, up on towers and scaffolds and everything. And you were always terrified. You were terrified, Jesus, he's going to go, oh my God, look at him, you know. And yet they seem to do it without any, and I don't remember personally any major accidents or injuries or anything like that during the construction of the building. But it was a kind of source of wonder to the population at the time, whether they liked it or not.
Harry Lawton was a carpenter who worked on the project for the Sisk Building Company. Over 50 years since he first set foot on site, he's now retracing his steps, working on a scale model of the cathedral. The building is almost 100 metres long and close to 50 metres in height at its tallest point. It's striking how precise every stage of the construction process had to be.
Well, it's amazing now. I'm coming across things doing that I hadn't thought about when it was actually being built, you know. And give you an example now, at the start when I'd be holding the tape for the general foreman when he was setting it out. And I said to him one day, well, like, oh, what kind of tolerance had you here, you know, when you're setting out the building? Oh, he said, on this now, he said about 1/4 of an inch, you know. So I reckoned to myself, you know, he's bullying me now, you know, because 1/4 of an inch is nothing, like you say. But when I started setting out the columns and all that there, it was then it really dawned on me. He had no control over the stones, because they were all cut in, you know, up in County Wicklow and sent down. So everything was cut to fit. Now, if his measurements were wrong, the stones wouldn't fit into it, you know. So he was right, like, but he had that worked out before he ever saw a stone coming in, yeah.
The opening of the cathedral in August 1965 was a major event for the church in Ireland. Cardinal Cushing of Boston was the chief celebrant at a mass of dedication, which was attended by hundreds of priests.
The 1960s was the height of the Irish missionary movement, and Galway county and city had hundreds of priests working abroad in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and so this was actually an occasion for them to come home and be part of the celebration. So many of the priests you see coming over the bridge in that footage are priests from Galway who were living and working among not just the Irish diaspora, but working in the missionary fields as well. Again, 1960s was a very harsh time in Ireland. Massive unemployment, massive immigration. So this celebration just became a huge event. It was a massive lift to the city at the time. It meant a lot to the people.
The vast interior of the building has several points of interest from an artistic perspective. Chief among them are 3 rose windows by George Campbell above the north, east and west entrances. Artist Patrick Pollan is well represented too. His mosaic of the crucifixion dominates the southern gable. Pollan's work also features in the mortuary chapel, where there are nods to the Irish-American experience and the revolutionary tradition. He was also responsible for mosaics on the commanding dome above the altar and for 26 of the original stained glass windows around the building. Additional windows were added for the Jubilee year of 2000. This year's golden anniversary is being marked with new works by local artist Vicky Crowley. The 14 Stations of the Cross are the work of Gabrielle Hayes. These were carved in white Portland stone over almost 2 decades.
In the 14 stations there are 28 life-size figures. So having installed the first station in 1962, the work continued, and the final station, which was Jesus Meets the Women of Jerusalem, was installed in 1976. 2 years later, Gabrielle Hayes died. So she did write at one point that she regarded the stations in Galway Cathedral as the main work of her life.
In the 50 years since it opened its doors, Galway Cathedral has become something of a tourist attraction, all the while retaining its primary purpose as a centre of worship. And that's something that's particularly apparent during this week's novena.
That's the beauty of a beautiful cathedral like this, that you can have tourists alongside a missionary, you can have tourists alongside somebody struggling. And that's the reality of church. It's made up of all these people, those who know that they're loved by God and those who don't. And I hope that those who do come here to see it as a beautiful piece of architecture see something more and see something deeper and see it as something that does give glory to God.
Well, that's Galway Cathedral. We all pass by it so often, but you know, if you're coming this way in the next while, you really should take a visit inside this iconic building in the heart of the city. Well, now it's competition.